Magic is fun, and in fantasy, it's almost expected to be present in some form. Even in a more realistic setting like Game of Thrones, there are dragons and at least a few active gods. Creating a magic system comes with its share of questions, though. For example, how do you make it both simple enough to be understood and complex enough to be interesting? Magic systems generally require two things: an input and an output. The input could be a gesture, words of power, a tool, some ingredients, or perhaps a mix of these. In Harry Potter, for example, magic is made with a tool, the wand, words, and emotion. The output, the magic, is the fireball, the mending of a wound, or the summoning of something you've conjured. It's the part we're probably most familiar with. In Avatar: The Last Airbender, the input is generally all martial arts-inspired gestures, but we can break the output into four categories, the four elements, that then have subcategories, things like metal or bloodbending, each with multiple uses. And that's where we get into the issue of complexity and cognitive overload. John Sweller developed the cognitive load theory in 1988, and while he wasn't necessarily talking about magic systems at the time, we can pull some valuable ideas from it. The whole theory is fascinating, but the short version basically states that a person can only retain a limited amount of information. Throw too much at them, and your audience will forget a lot of what you've said. On a more emotional side of this problem, the person who is being overloaded with that information can feel overwhelmed, confused, and discouraged. Generally not things we want our audience to feel when they read or view our work. So, how does cognitive load theory apply to fireballs and eldritch blasts? It's easy to want to pack your magic full of awesome things that you love, which is great, but that can often lead to overcomplicated systems, or too many systems. In an interview that I did with Brian McClellan for our friends at World Building Magazine, he said, "The four magic systems in the Powder Mage series are, in retrospect, way too much and made me a victim of my own enthusiasm. I went into it with the idea that I'd have three systems to mirror the three social classes of the real-world time period equivalent, and a fourth that was meant to be something apart from the status quo. Balancing them was kind of a pain in the neck, and I never really succeeded in giving them equal time on the page." So, how do you craft a magic system that's easy enough for your audience to understand, but complex enough to make it feel fresh and exciting? We need to go back to those concepts of the input, output, and consider them with cognitive load theory in mind. When one part of your magic system is complex, the other should be relatively simple. If neither is very complex, neither has to be too simple. And if you have multiple systems, that's more to remember, and so each one should overall be less complicated. That's one reason why Avatar: The Last Airbender works so well. The input, martial arts, is very easy to understand, especially in a visual medium. Yet the output is varied enough to be exciting. And even that isn't too complicated. A firebender creating a fireball is something that needs little explanation, but it's still fun to watch, and sometimes the characters use bending in ways we don't expect. When it was first shown, bloodbending was a great example of that. We should also consider the context around the magic system. If the plot is simple, you might be able to make the elements around it a bit more complicated. If you have a large cast of characters, each involved in a series of nefarious plots, your audience has to keep all this in mind as well and won't be able to retain as much information about things like the magic system. And if your magic ties in with the plot, you can actually use them to reinforce one another, but that's a topic for another time. If you're not sure if your magic system, or really any part of your story, is too complicated, share it with somebody. If you have a chapter written where you showcase the magic alongside the characters and the plot, that's even better. A lot of writing is in the editing and reviewing of your work, so don't be afraid to try something new. Alright, that was a lot in a short amount of time, so let's do a quick summary. Magic can generally be broken down into two components, an input and an output. When presented with a new system, your audience will have to learn both, so consider what you're asking them to remember and logically understand. According to the cognitive load theory, people have a limited amount of information they can process and retain. Work with it instead of against it, and people will generally have a better experience. While you can make both the input and output of your magic complex, it puts a strain on the audience to retain all that information. Instead, we should always seek a balance. And finally, other factors such as your plot will impact how much your audience can remember about world-building elements like your magic system. Run your plans or your story itself by somebody else and see how much they are able to understand and retain. It's important to trust your audience, but your perspective of how easy it is to follow your story will always be biased, so it's important to get feedback. As always, these are all guidelines, not rules. But generally speaking, confused audiences don't go on to rate your book 5 stars and recommend it to a friend. I'm speaking from personal experience on that one. Thanks for watching.